Mind evidence, where psychology becomes understanding.
In the mid-1980s, fear spread across California as a wave of seemingly random attacks began to terrorize entire communities. The crimes occurred at night. The victims varied in age, gender, and background. There appeared to be no clear pattern. The media would soon give the unknown offender a name: the Night Stalker. Between 1984 and 1985, Richard Ramirez carried out a series of home invasion assaults, murders, and sexual attacks across Los Angeles and San Francisco. He entered homes while victims were sleeping, choosing targets at random without prior connection or familiarity. His crimes were marked by extreme unpredictability, sudden violence, and a deliberate use of fear and intimidation. Unlike many serial offenders, Ramirez showed no consistent victim profile and no emotional attachment to his targets. The randomness of the attacks amplified public terror and overwhelmed law enforcement efforts. The case ended in 1985 after Ramirez was recognized by members of the public and apprehended following a violent pursuit. His arrest brought relief, but also raised disturbing questions. Richard Ramirez openly embraced a dark and provocative identity, showing no remorse and often glorifying violence during his trial. And this is where psychology becomes essential, because understanding Richard Ramirez means examining a personality shaped by severe trauma, antisocial behavior, and a profound detachment from moral boundaries. In 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death in California. He remained on death row for more than 2 decades and died on June 7, 2013, at Marin General Hospital in California due to complications related to illness. Richard Ramirez did not emerge from nowhere. He was not born a predator in the way myths often suggest. His violence developed over time, shaped by trauma, fractured identity, and psychological mechanisms that transformed pain into terror. To understand Ramirez, we must look at the mind behind the crimes, not the spectacle of them. At the psychological core of Richard Ramirez's development was early and repeated trauma. Trauma in childhood does not simply create fear. It reshapes how the brain understands safety, trust, and identity. Chronic exposure to violence, neglect, or abuse teaches the mind that the world is unpredictable and hostile. For some children, the nervous system adapts by becoming hypervigilant. For others, it adapts by becoming emotionally numb. Ramirez showed signs of both. Identity develops through stable relationships, emotional mirroring, and consistent boundaries. When those elements are missing or replaced with fear, the developing self becomes fragmented. In such environments, identity is not built through belonging, it is built through survival. For Ramirez, identity did not stabilize around empathy or connection. It stabilized around power, dominance, and fear. Psychologically, repeated exposure to violence during development can reduce emotional responsiveness. This is called desensitization. When violence becomes familiar, it stops triggering alarm. It becomes background noise. Desensitization does not create violence by itself, but it removes internal barriers that would normally prevent it. In Ramirez's case, violence was not shocking. It was normalized. Over time, Ramirez displayed behaviors consistent with antisocial personality traits. These traits include disregard for others, impulsivity, lack of remorse, violation of social norms. Antisocial behavior is not simply rule-breaking. It reflects a deeper disconnect from social and emotional reciprocity. The individual no longer experiences others as fully real. One of the most significant psychological drivers in Ramirez's behavior was fear as reinforcement. Fear gave him visibility. Fear created impact. Fear confirmed existence. In individuals with fragile identity, causing fear can feel like control. and control feels like stability. This is not pleasure in the traditional sense, it is regulation. Another critical element was violent fantasy. Psychology shows that repeated fantasy strengthens emotional pathways. The brain rehearses behavior long before it appears externally. Fantasy becomes a laboratory where identity is tested. For Ramirez, fantasy was not an escape from reality. It was preparation. During acts of extreme violence, many individuals experience dissociation. Dissociation is a psychological separation from emotional experience. It reduces pain, it reduces fear, it reduces empathy. This allows behavior that would otherwise be psychologically intolerable. Ramirez often appeared emotionally detached, as if observing rather than participating. This detachment protected the psyche from collapse. Moral development requires emotional connection. Without empathy, moral rules remain abstract. Ramirez understood rules intellectually, but they carried no emotional weight. This creates a dangerous gap. Behavior becomes guided by impulse and fantasy rather than internalized ethics. Psychologically, Ramirez's crimes communicated something, not ideology, not protest, but presence. Terror forced recognition. For individuals who feel invisible or erased, terror becomes a language. It says, "I exist and you cannot ignore me." Healthy identity integrates multiple roles: child, adult, citizen. In Ramirez, identity remained unintegrated. Different parts of the self operated without coordination, impulse without regulation, fantasy without correction. This fragmentation increased risk. Substance use further weakened psychological barriers. Drugs and alcohol reduce inhibition and increase impulsivity. They do not create pathology, they amplify what already exists. In Ramirez, substances removed the last restraints. Society often labels individuals like Ramirez as monsters. Psychologically, this is comforting. It creates distance, but it prevents understanding. Ramirez was human, and that is precisely why understanding his psychology matters. It is crucial to say this clearly. Most people who experience trauma do not become violent. What increases risk is convergence, chronic trauma, identity fragmentation, antisocial traits, desensitization, fantasy rehearsal, lack of intervention. When these factors align, danger increases. Understanding cases like Ramirez is not about fascination. It is about prevention. Psychology teaches that early intervention, emotional regulation, and identity support can interrupt these trajectories. Violence is not inevitable, but ignorance makes it more likely. Richard Ramirez represents what can happen when trauma is left untreated, identity remains fractured, and fear becomes the only form of control. His psychology reminds us that terror is not born fully formed. It is built slowly through neglect, violence, and psychological isolation. At Mind Evidence, we analyze criminal behavior through psychology, not mythology. This is Mind Evidence, where psychology becomes understanding.